Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, September 2nd. We made it. We finally made it to yet another month. We got 4 more left in 2020. We can do it. I know we can. And I've got a very exciting episode for you guys today. But first, I want to get some housekeeping done. It's a new month, so I want to talk about the show at large, talk about what my episodes are going to look like moving forward, because I am now at school. I'm back at school. I am a film student, so that means that I watch a lot of movies for school, which means I'm going to have less time to watch movies that I would choose for these episodes. And so what takes precedent for all of these episodes, obviously, is new movies. I'm always going to be talking about a new movie every episode. I want to make sure that I can give you a review on something recent, because I know that's what a lot of people want to watch, including myself. But there are some movies that I won't get to choose anymore, because I'm going to watch them for school, and I'm always going to try and tie them back to whatever I watched as far as the new movie goes, see if I can weave things together, make it a little bit more coherent. But still, there might not be as obvious a theme for every episode as there was in the past, so I just wanted to let you guys know that. Additionally, you may have noticed if you're following movie news, but a lot of movie theaters opened on August 20th, so the movies are back officially in the United States. Obviously, not everywhere is open, but a majority of them are. I'm currently in Philadelphia, and for some reason, they didn't open August 20th. I think it had to do with like the city mandates for a little bit, but they're now opening on September 8th, I believe, September 7th or 8th, right near me. And so I'm going to do my best to go see some of those movies in theaters. But obviously, COVID-19 is still a big issue, and I want to be cautious. I want to be as cautious as possible for my own safety, for the safety of my neighbors. And so I'm not going to go as often as I would like to. I'm still going to try and get out there, and I also can't necessarily recommend for you guys to go out there. If you do, please be safe. Please take necessary medical precautions, social distancing, wear a mask. But when I do, I'll let you guys know, and I do still want to try and go sometimes. I know a lot of theaters are functioning at like 30-40% capacity, so that's nice. And I have this kind of growing suspicion that there aren't going to be that many people at the movies anyway, so that's also a positive. We want to make sure everyone's staying safe, and so I hope that you guys are staying safe, staying happy, and if you do go see a movie, make sure you're being cautious with everything, as will I. But now, this episode, let's talk about what movies I'm going to be talking about this episode. Okay, the first one, the theme, there is still a theme. I did watch a movie for school this week, but I was able to tie it in pretty nicely. So this week is going to be another documentary episode, which is something that I do want to continue doing maybe once a month, maybe once or twice a month. I do love documentaries, and there are not a lot that I've actually seen as of recent, and so I do want to kind of like catch up. I want to just grow my knowledge on documentaries. I think they're a really important art form and a form of filmmaking. So the first one is one that is not quite as recent. It came out earlier this year, I think like around February or March officially. I was actually supposed to see it at a film festival, the Annapolis Film Festival, that ended up going online, and they had a partnership where you were able to stream it for a little bit of money, but it wasn't a part of their digital film festival, which is what I ended up attending. And so I never got to see it then, but then recently, I think within the past month or two, it appeared on Hulu. So that is Spaceship Earth. I knew very little about this story. I was very curious about it, and I ended up really enjoying it. So that's the first one. The second one is the one that I watched for class. I am in a class where we study how to do adaptations of things, and the first stuff that we're doing is adaptations of real historical events, docudramas, or documentaries. And so the first one is a documentary called The Central Park Five. It details the events of the Jogger case and the Central Park Five in 1989, and it's a Ken Burns documentary from 2012. I knew a little bit about this case. I'm also now watching the Ava DuVernay series, When They See Us, which I have watched the first episode and can definitely recommend if you're curious about that. And she's obviously somebody who did my favorite documentary ever, 13th, so check that out. I know I've recommended that before, but even still. So this is a documentary that I watched for class, but it was also something that I enjoyed quite a bit. And then the third one is my weekly recommendation, and that one is called Free Solo. It's streaming on Disney Plus, I believe. I'm not 100% positive because I watched it a little while ago, but it is a National Geographic movie, so I think it should be on Disney Plus. And that one is from 2018. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. And so this is a pretty good episode. All of these things I can recommend to you. And then finally, I know there's a long intro. I'm sorry. This won't happen as often. Usually it's like a minute or two if you're new, but this is just general housekeeping and also what the movies are this week. So for my final segment, I want you guys to stay tuned until the very end because it's a new month, which means we get to talk about some of the movie news from the past month, which is a segment that I always really like doing because there is some stuff that I know, but then there's also a lot of stuff that I didn't know that I got to do some research on. And so I'll be talking about the movie news of August 2020 as we move into September and the rest of the year. So that is today's episode. I hope that you guys are excited, and let's get started. Okay, so the first documentary is Spaceship Earth. It's streaming right now on Hulu, came out earlier this year, and it basically follows a group of scientists, artists, free thinkers that decided to build a biosphere called the Biosphere 2 in 1991 that would help them understand the inner workings of our atmosphere, our Earth, and then also how that could be implemented into time travel and all of the things that surrounded that event. So, I knew nothing about this. So I was not born until the very late 90s, so I knew nothing of this. This is also something that like I had never heard talked about. Maybe this was a really big event as detailed in the movie. It's seemingly a very big event, but I knew nothing, which was great. I think it's a really great way to go into the movie. There's no expectations, but I was definitely curious. And I have to say that I did enjoy this a lot. I don't think it's necessarily like my favorite thing. I think some of it tends to get a little bit muddled at the end. But overall, I thought this was a very good movie. It was a very well put together documentary. Unlike some of the other movies that I talk about in previous episodes, more narrative movies, I obviously can't talk about the screenplay or the acting in this, so I'm going to be talking about story and characters to start. And to start with the story is very compelling. It starts actually, so obviously it kind of starts around 1991 to give an introduction to what the Biosphere 2 is, and then it goes back in time to the early 70s to talk about just the idea of the collective and a lot of people who ended up being a part of Biosphere 2 and where that was going, and some of the cast of characters that ended up being a big deal later on and how they met and what they were doing. And so this was a really interesting introduction. I thought this was great. It was fast-paced, it was compelling, it was intriguing, we got a good understanding of some of the characters, and honestly it was pretty miraculous. It's a very larger than life. That's probably not grammatically correct. It's a larger than life story. It's really hard, at least for me, to comprehend a lot of what happened in the beginning of this movie, or the beginning of this story that's being detailed. So it's like a group of people. It follows a couple different people in the beginning, but early on, it's a few different people that end up meeting under the guise of a collective or a commune, which apparently was fairly common in the 70s. It was just a group of free thinkers that wanted to do a lot of things. Most of them were artists. There's a very theatrical aspect of it all, but some of them were scientists. Some of them were builders, architects, and so they do a lot of different things, and they just kind of want to like be free. They just want to do things. It's a very hippie mentality, which I think coincided with the 70s. Obviously, that's sort of the aesthetic that they're going for, at least depicting that in the movie. So, like, one of the things that was hard for me to comprehend was the fact that they could, like, buy a very big piece of land in the middle of Arizona and just build stuff. That's not something that's, like, plausible, really, nowadays. They then go on to talk about how they built a giant boat and just sent it out into the ocean at a certain point, so all of this is just kind of crazy. Like, I was completely baffled and blown away by the events in the beginning of this movie, which makes the story very, very intriguing to watch. And then the development of where they go tends to make a lot of sense. So if you had kind of been introduced to these characters in 1991 or in the late 80s just to see like the beginning of the biosphere or where that's coming from, you might understand, because not a lot of them are actually scientists right off the bat. So a lot of them are just artists, culturalists, people that are really interested in a lot of different forms of intellectualism or expression in any sort of confine. And so understanding why they would build a huge biosphere, creating their own little atmosphere, or how they'd even have the ability to do that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But then you kind of get this understanding that they all work together in a really collaborative way, and they also are all just very intelligent in their own way. And so I like the development. I think it develops really, really nicely. And it starts out with all the sort of like insane different contraptions that they're making on different pieces of land. And then they detail how they're making money on that, and so they have a financial backer who is a billionaire. They don't explain how they got involved with this person, but so that just seemed like luck of the draw that they were able to to get all this financial backing. And so they would go somewhere, build something, and then that would raise the property value of, so that Ed Bass could get his money back and make a large profit. And so that kind of is the beginning, probably 45 minutes or so. And then we start to get into the bulk of the story with the biosphere, which interestingly enough is less interesting to me. Like, I found sort of the outlandish things that they, like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but they built a giant boat, like, and it's a huge boat, and they just put it out in the ocean, and they didn't have any experience with this, and it was before the internet. And so that, I think, was more interesting to me, ultimately speaking. I did really like the biosphere stuff. I think what tends to be more interesting as the story progresses is the actual drama that ends up becoming a big part of it. So it's a lot of people with varying personalities. They had a huge emphasis on at least diversity of thought, and diversity of, ability. And so they wanted to kind of create a very collaborative process when doing this, but that creates for some conflict of interest, some conflict of personalities. And so that tends to play out both in the media depiction of everything as kind of how it starts, and then in the group dynamics of things once they actually get into the biosphere. So that made the story a lot more compelling, because a lot of times in documentaries you may not be able to understand where the conflict lies, especially in documentaries like this where it's strictly historical and it's a lot of archival footage. So sometimes they have to either create conflict, or the conflict is easier to distinguish in hindsight or whatever, so it's not quite as compelling. But here, there's a really good sense of what the stakes are, what the dramatic and emotional stakes are. It's a lot of just kind of like personal involvement, so it's not necessarily like this large thing. There is some, obviously, financial stakes, but we don't really get a sense of that. Plus, a lot of this is being funded by a billionaire, so we don't really necessarily care about it. It doesn't really hurt him overall. And so that we do get like a good sense of what the stakes are throughout the movie. And so I thought that was really great. The one thing about the story that I didn't like as much is that towards the end of the movie, I think the message gets a little bit muddy as to what the message of the movie actually is, which is a little bit frustrating because I feel like the message is pretty clear here, or it should be. Just the idea of all of us being able to work together, or that we have an impact, whether it be in a friend group, in a group of people, or in the grand scheme of things in our own Earth, in the globe. And so it's a very big sort of like environmentalist message, but then also a really big like communal message, which I think is really interesting. But then we get to sort of this thing at the end where they bring up Steve Bannon, who is obviously a political figure of the past couple of years with the Trump administration. And so it seems to be somewhat of not necessarily an attack, but also kind of an attack on a specific person who is now involved in politics. And although that's a perfectly fine message to be putting out, if that was the original intention, it just seems to kind of undermine what the main message of it, and ends up being a little bit more gossipy, which seems to reflect the actual events of the story as opposed to what the like higher understanding of things should be, of like we should all be working together and take accountability for our own actions. So I thought that was a little bit odd. It didn't necessarily take away from anything, but I do think either it should have been not included at all and have him be a minor player at the end, or have it be a much bigger deal, which I would have argued that should have been the way they go and have that kind of underline throughout the whole thing. But even still, that might be somewhat of a nitpick. I just thought the message should have been a bit more clear than it actually was. All right, moving on to the characters. There is a really great amount of varied personalities throughout this. We get a really good understanding of who some people are throughout it. There are a lot of different characters, so sometimes I feel like there could maybe even be too many for us to understand, but I do think starting from the 70s and getting a good basis of who the main players are, who the most important ones that we're going to be following, and obviously who the ones that we're seeing the testimonials from, they're going to be probably a big player compared to some of the others who we don't. And so I liked seeing that from the beginning. I think it was fairly clear who they were, but I do think sometimes it focused on maybe too many people and got a little bit confusing at times if you're not really paying attention. But the ability to have all of these characters and they play a really good back and forth on each other, it creates this gossip and this interpersonal drama, which I thought was really fascinating. The production design is a little bit difficult to do in a documentary because you don't want to obviously move anything around. And then also here, it's mostly historical, and so there isn't really any sort of production design that you can do. But there is a ton of footage on this group of people, and so that was, I think, probably one of the reasons the filmmakers decided to make this movie in the first place. But it also creates a really dynamic sense of space and sense of time and where we are and who these people are. The biggest thing too was the kind of overall aesthetic of the biosphere, and then also what the biospherians look like with their red jumpsuits, which looked visually awesome. I know that that wasn't intentional for the documentary, but it was intentional for a lot of the media pieces on them at the time. So I thought that was great. It looks fantastic. It's also just a really sci-fi looking aesthetic, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. The cinematography, I think, has a really solid sense or use of archival footage, because that's kind of all they can use for most of it, but they have a ton of it and they use it really, really well. I think it pairs really nicely with a lot of the voiceover that happens. The testimonials, I wouldn't say are necessarily anything special. That's kind of the only form of cinematography that is being used, other than maybe a couple B-roll footage of some exterior landscapes and things. But the testimonials are sort of the bulk of what the modern cinematography is, and there's nothing all that special. It looks like a typical testimonial with the character framed in the right third of the screen. I do say that the depth of field looks pretty good. John Allen is put in a biosphere type environment, which I think looks really good. So it's not bad, but it's also nothing inventive overall. The editing, I think, is really nice. It's paced really well. It's a 2-hour movie. I don't think it really feels like a 2-hour movie until you get maybe to the last 20 minutes. I think you kind of are like, all right, I get it. Let's keep going. And that's where I think the message gets a little bit undermined sometimes. But the editing I thought was really solid. There's a really great back and forth between the video and the photos that are being used. So it's not always videos, and so it doesn't get boring. You don't ever know what to expect with the next shot. So I thought that was really well done. It's also really fast paced with the voiceover. This is something that I'm going to talk about kind of comparatively in the next documentary, because I think they're similar in a sense, or it's cool to kind of compare them, contrast their style. But I thought the voiceover most of the time was from the testimonials, and we don't really hold on the testimonials all that much. We go to the photos or the videos, which I think creates the sense of pacing and makes it a lot more interesting to watch. So that was really good. The sound, I have to say, not all that memorable. I can't really remember what the score was trying to convey other than the sense of stakes, the sense of time with some influences based on when these things took place. But overall, not all that memorable, similar to the cinematography. But the directing, I think, is really solid. It has a good sense of timing. It also lets the audience sort of decide what the message should be by the end. I do think that the message should have been a little bit more clear, a little bit more concrete than it ended up being. But overall, I do think this is a very well-made documentary. And I enjoyed watching it. I thought it was a really compelling story, which is obviously a big chunk of what a documentary should be. So I'm going to give this one a strong 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I can recommend it if you're a big documentary fan or if you're interested in the story, and that is streaming right now on Hulu. So I would go check it out. And next up, I'm going to be talking about my weekly watch, which was the Central Park 5. Then I'm going to be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is called Free Solo. And finally, stay tuned until the very end where I give some of the biggest movie news from the past month. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around, I have just given my review of Spaceship Earth. I'll now be going into my weekly watch called the Central Park 5. Then I'll be talking about my weekly recommendation called Free Solo. And finally, stay tuned until the very end where I give you a rundown of the latest movie news from the past month. So right now is the Central Park 5, a film by Ken Burns from 2012. I want to give a brief content warning for violence, sexual assault, and racial discrimination, because these are all very heavy topics, so I want to make sure that you guys know that going into it. But the story basically details a case from 1989 called the Jogger case that involved 5 teenagers, young black teenagers from New York, being charged for the assault and rape of a young white woman, with all of the holes in the legal case and then the eventual discovery that they were not involved based on new DNA evidence post their prison sentence. So this is a very difficult story to comprehend. It's a very hard watch. And this is a case that I knew a little bit about. I didn't know all that much going into it. I knew sort of the general basis of it because I think given obviously recent events in American history, I think a lot of cases similar to this are being brought back up or being examined right now in the context of a much more progressive set of ideologies, and so a lot of these are being examined in a way that never was before, which is a very positive development in American history. And so I think that's sort of how I kind of knew about this. Ava DuVernay had made a series a couple years ago called When They See Us that details the entire thing. It's a docudrama, a 4-part series that I am watching right now. But this is a much more sort of analytical documentary that attempts to outline all of the events in as objective as possible a lens. And so I was definitely very curious about this. I can't say that I am a big Ken Burns fan. He has a very distinct style of documentary, and I think one of the reasons I hesitate to use this because there are a lot of people who are Ken Burns fans, and this is not to undermine him as a creator. I think he is a very talented, very accomplished filmmaker, and so although it might not be my cup of tea, I think that he is a very talented creator. That being said, a lot of people I think fall into the same camp that I do, find a lot of his things a little bit slow, sometimes a little bit boring, even given the subject material. And so a lot of people I think view documentaries as a whole in just the style of Ken Burns. Like, this is what a documentary is, because it's what a lot of people were shown when they were younger in class, in an educational context. And so sometimes I think this is why people might get turned off from documentaries. That I think is changing, and I do think that there are a lot of people who really enjoy Ken Burns. Obviously, he is a very successful creator, but I just want to get that out of the way that I'm not a huge Ken Burns fan. But I will say that I enjoyed this one probably more so than I enjoy any of his past ones. This is a much more recent historical event that he is detailing, so I think that he has a lot of different tools at his disposal, which makes things a bit more entertaining. So the thing that I think comes to mind for a lot of people is his Civil War documentary. I think that's one of his, if not his most popular. And he does a lot of things that are based on events from the past that might not have any footage involved with it. This one, however, has a bunch of archival footage as well as a bunch of photos and obviously a lot of first-hand accounts from all 5 of the kids who are no longer kids, obviously, talking about their experiences. So this was in 1989, and now it is or at the time of the documentary, it was 2012, so they are much older. They have served their sentences and also been exonerated, and so they have also had some time to reflect on everything. So it's really fascinating to see their testimonials, and obviously very important. So I do think this was pretty good, but there are some things that I think lacked from just a filmmaking standpoint. But let's just talk about the whole movie as a whole. The story obviously is very compelling. It is horrific to watch. It's really difficult to sit with, and the film lets you sit with it. So I think the one thing that Ken Burns' style adds to this type of a story is just the sheer amount of treachery of this entire story. So like, for example, much of the documentary takes place in the interrogation room, and so it also talks about sort of how police officers and detectives can crack down on people by spending so much time, and to really wear people down by not giving them any food, not giving them any sleep, getting in their face, and so really wearing people out, especially if they're kids that are all under the age of 18. And so that's something that gets detailed here, and it gets detailed in a way that's different than the rest of the movie. So the movie has a bunch of different developments that happen. It details the entire story, but an entire 30 minutes are given just to the interrogation, whereas no other major plot development is given that much time. And so I think it's really supposed to be there to detail how these kids might have felt, obviously in a no stakes, small context, but in understanding how the film works, getting to sit with this for much longer makes you understand a little bit of how these kids might have been feeling in that scenario. And so I keep saying this, it's a very difficult watch, but I think it's a really important one, and I think one of the things that really adds to it is how detailed it is. It has really every aspect of the story, so it starts before the event took place, and then it goes into the interrogation, and then it goes into the court case, and then it goes into their prison sentence, and then their post-prison life. And so it goes through the entire thing, which gets you a really solid understanding of what the story is. But I think the most important thing is that it really gives back some of the narrative to the 5 people that were involved in this case. And so for the longest time, before they had been exonerated, or obviously when the story first broke, these kids didn't get any say in their own narrative. It was kind of thrust upon them in a very, very negative light. And so giving them the ability to talk about what they had gone through really humanizes them, obviously. And it also gives us an understanding of how the system, how racial profiling can really affect young people, and then eventually into their adulthood, because obviously this has sort of sustained with them for such a long time. And so I really enjoyed, maybe enjoyed is the wrong word, but I really found the testimonials and the firsthand accounts to be the best part of the documentary. I think that was the most important part of the documentary, and yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I think also all the reveals happen at the right time, so if you don't know the story, or even if you do, where things get revealed happens at the right time. The beginning of the film, you actually know who the actual perpetrator was. And I think that's really important to understand the case at large, and to give us the context of who the 5 kids are, because they really are not related to this case at all. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I think that's an important development that happens very, very early. And then I think also how I detailed the fact that the interrogation happened for so long in the documentary. I think all of these plot developments happen at the right time from a filmmaking standpoint. The characters, the people involved, we get a very solid understanding of who all of them are. I think the appropriate amount of time is spent with every single person, so it really is the 5 people that were involved. So Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Corey Weiss, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salaam are all major players, obviously in the story, but then also in the film context, and we get to see all of them each person gets roughly the same amount of screen time. I would say Kevin Richardson and Raymond Santana probably get the most. And then Antron McCray is also in that category, but he did not appear in the film, his voiceover. He wanted to protect his identity, so he's not shown in the film. It's just his voice. But all three of them, I think, get the most. But I do think that all five of them get an appropriate amount of screen time to tell their story, and we also get to empathize with them through that screen time. We also get a lot of historical and legal context that I think is really important to understanding the case in a very holistic way. So we really get the emotional side of things, and we get the much more analytical legal side of things, which I think is really important in telling the story for people who are familiar or maybe even who are not familiar, which was kind of the camp that I was in, and I do think that it served myself in understanding the whole thing. The production design, I would say that all of the testimonials look fairly similar. The testimonials are nothing special. It tends to be a similar thing to Spaceship Earth. I would say Spaceship Earth is a bit more dynamic in how it's shown, with like the depth of field and things, but all of the characters are like sitting in a chair, 1/3 of the screen, usually the right or left third. Middle third wouldn't make much sense. So one of those 2/3, and then telling their story. The background is a little bit different for, the 5 members involved, but then it is for the legal advice, the legal counsel kind of on this documentary. So it's important to distinguish them, obviously. So that looks a little bit different. I also think that even though they all look the same and none of them are all that interesting to look at, this documentary, that's not what it's trying to do. Ken Burns isn't trying to be revolutionary in how he's telling the story. I think he wants to tell the story, and sort of where he makes those directorial choices happen from a story standpoint than it does from an actual production standpoint. And more importantly, he's not trying to be flashy with anything. He wants to tell this story in a way that's not distracting from the actual people involved. So I do think that that's an important thing to distinguish, even though it might not be as visually interesting as some other documentaries. As far as the cinematography goes, very similar to Spaceship Earth, there is a really solid use of archival footage and B-roll, as well as mixing it in with photos. I think there are less photos than there would be for Spaceship Earth, but most of it is archival footage and B-roll, which makes it a bit more interesting to watch than it would be kind of for that Civil War documentary that I talked about earlier, that I think is a little bit dull, I think, especially for kids when they're shown it in high school or middle school, which it was for me. The main difference here, the reason I wanted to compare kind of the Central Park 5 and Spaceship Earth, is because they're similar documentaries in the sense that it is mostly modern day testimonials with people involved in an event from 20, 30 years prior. And so it's a lot of archival footage and testimonial work where it's not much else, and then some photos which would fall into the archival footage. But the big difference here, because obviously Spaceship Earth is very fast-paced, like I said, whereas the Central Park 5 is much slower, and much of Ken Burns' is much slower. And I think the reason comes down to editing, and much of what the Central Park 5 does that Spaceship Earth doesn't do is all of the testimonials, or most of the testimonials are not do not serve as voiceover for the rest of the film. So when a character is speaking, when a person is speaking, we're seeing them speak. We're watching them do it. We're sitting with their testimonial, which for a story like this is a really excellent choice because it makes us really just sit with it. It gives it time to breathe. We get a solid understanding of what it is without any sort of visual distractions, whereas Spaceship Earth, not many of the testimonials are shown in full. Most of them serve as a voiceover for the rest of the story. So it means that they can tell a larger story. So the time of the story, I think, scopes longer in Spaceship Earth than the Central Park 5, but it also is just to keep the pace going, whereas the Central Park 5, the importance is not keeping the pace going, it's really understanding what the story is and sitting with it, and so that is shown through the editing and the pacing, which I think is really important, even though it's not something that might not be as enjoyable for a lot of people. The other thing, too, that's interesting about the Central Park 5 is that it uses title cards in a very unique way. A lot of documentaries, I think, use title cards, but in this one, it kind of serves as a voiceover. The only real voiceover in this, sometimes, obviously, the testimonials bleed into the footage, which is sort of just a filmmaking technique to make things smoother. So that does happen sometimes, but most of it happens from the actual perpetrator of the event, Mateus Reyes, where he is sort of detailing the events, and that happens in the beginning. It also happens sort of in the middle end of the film, and so the title cards kind of serve as the voiceover or the voice of God, which is how it's talked about in documentaries a lot of times. So it's supposed to be sort of this impartial, omnipotent voice giving us information that we might not get just from the people involved, to give us like full context of things. And so I think that was a really unique way to slow down the pacing, because it's not done through voiceover, it's done through title cards, and it really makes you pay attention for a documentary like this. That's also very necessary. The score is very complementary to everything else. It is slow, it's methodical, it underlines a lot of just sort of the archival moments. It underlines sometimes the testimonials, but not quite as much. I think the testimonials are given the most room to breathe, so the score is sort of underlying everything else at times to sort of emphasize what you're supposed to be feeling in a scene like that. All of it is fairly similar. It's kind of downtrodden melancholy, but still slow and methodical, which is sort of the tone of the entire score and ultimately the tone of the entire film. As far as the directing goes, I'm obviously not a big fan of the directing, even though I do think it serves the story really well. Actually, that's not true. I'm not going to say that I'm not a big fan of the directing for a film like this. I'm just not a big fan of this style of filmmaking. Do I think that this story could have been told in a different way? Yes. Do I think that this was a very impactful way to tell this story and all of the directorial choices served that? Also, yes. This was an excellent way to tell this story. I think it really lets you kind of understand things, but really sit with it. You do have to be patient watching this. It's a very difficult watch. So just from a more personal standpoint, I don't like it quite as much as Spaceship Earth. Maybe that goes with my attention span. Maybe that goes with the ultimate sort of difficulty of the content, but I'm going to give this one a soft 7 out of 10. So not all that different. Also can definitely recommend it to you if you're a fan of documentaries or if you're interested in understanding the nuances of what this case was, and what the implications of it was from a personal and historical cultural standpoint. So definitely a very good documentary. Can recommend. It's free on the PBS website, so go check that out if you have the time. But right now we're going to go into my weekly recommendation, which is called Free Solo. And finally, stay tuned to the very end where I talk about some of the biggest movie news from the past month. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Spaceship Earth, the Central Park 5, and I'll now be going into my weekly recommendation, which is a documentary called Free Solo. And finally, stay tuned until the very end where I talk about some of the biggest movie news of the past month. So right now is Free Solo, which is a documentary from 2018. It follows Alex Honnold, who wants to be the first free solo climber to successfully climb El Capitan in Yosemite. So this film is streaming right now on not only Disney Plus, but Hulu. I looked it up for you guys. You're welcome. But I watched this a couple months ago with my family, and I've been wanting to watch it for a long time. It's a very successful documentary. It won Best Documentary Feature at the Oscars, at the Academy Awards. And I have to say that this documentary is fantastic. Obviously, it's my weekly recommendation, so I'm going to think it's pretty good. But this documentary just shows how you can combine a fantastic subject material and also fantastic filmmaking to make an all-around fantastic documentary. I said this in my last documentary episode, but I really feel that to make a perfect documentary, you have to have the perfect blend of story and production. And so basically, like, the first 5 stars of a movie, like if we're going on a 10 scale, first 5 stars of the movie are the story. If the story is compelling, if it's interesting, if it's well told, 5 stars right off the bat. But if the production isn't that good, I'm probably not going to give it that high of a rating because it's ultimately not a very good documentary. You can have an extremely compelling story, and if it's poorly made, it's not a great documentary. Here, you get all of it. It is so well told, and it's all, like, I watched the trailer again before doing this, and every single time I watch it, like, I get sweaty. Like, my hands get sweaty. If you guys are not aware, free soloing is basically rock climbing without a rope. So extremely dangerous. They say in the trailer and in the movie that anybody who's made free soloing a big part of their life is dead now, basically. It has an extremely high mortality rate. Anybody who is a big part of the free soloing community has a very low life expectancy. It's extremely dangerous. And so watching it, both kind of from the filmmaking techniques and also just from the story at hand, you feel everything. Like, just thinking about it, my hands are getting sweaty. It's crazy watching this thing. It's absolutely bonkers. So let's go into the story of it. What I think is really fantastic about this documentary, which is pretty much what I'm going to talk about probably the most as far as how good of a documentary it is that the filmmakers insert themselves into the story. Not only is this a story about Alex and about free soloing, but it's also a story about documentary filmmaking and what the ethics of documentary filmmaking are. So one of the big things about this is that the filmmakers, Jimmy Chin and Elizabeth Chai Vasarhelyi, is that they didn't necessarily want to make this movie for a long time. They were worried that inserting themselves as documentarians and putting camera angles and adding the idea of the world kind of watching him would influence how he rock climbs and would add to the intensity and the danger levels of everything. And so I think a really impactful thing for me is understanding what the ethics of documentary filmmaking is, because I think if you're filmmaking I'm grammatically all over the place today. But anybody who watches a documentary, I think, who isn't necessarily a big film person, isn't going to think about the filming of it. Like anything, there's a suspension of disbelief. And a lot of times really solid documentaries are treated similarly to narrative films. And so the documentarian is not necessarily a big part of the filmmaking. And so, or not a big part of the story. I apologize. So if you're watching it with just the lens of wanting to be immersed into the story, you're not going to be thinking about the filmmaking. And so sometimes there are really intense stories that kind of personally are not really morally or ethically sound to film or to be involved with. And this is actually a big part of the Netflix series American Vandal, which is a satire about documentary filmmaking, docuseries, which I know this is a movie podcast, but it's one of my favorite shows. It's criminally underrated, so I have to recommend that to you guys if you're a fan of comedy and documentary. Anyway, so just the idea of what the ethics of documentary filmmaking being a part of things is really important in Free Solo. It's basically two different stories that are being told, and one is kind of the subtext of the other, but they weave both together in a really interesting way. And because you're so in tune to the filmmaking of it all, I think that adds to the element of you feeling like you're a part of the story. So you're really intimately involved into the relationships of everything. And so Alex has a really strong relationship, obviously, with the filmmakers, who are also rock climbers in their free time. And then you also, really the only other major relationship in the film is Alex and his girlfriend. And so you get an intimate portrayal of that as well. So you really have an understanding of who the character is, along with how the filming is involved in his life and how that influences his rock climbing. And so you feel like you're a part of the story, which just adds to how terrifying this whole thing is. And like, I don't think I'd be quite as on edge the whole time if that wasn't such a big part of the story. And you also get a really solid sense of the stakes, because there are such high stakes in this film. Not only are there high physical stakes, but because you get an understanding of not only Alex's psyche, but also all of the other characters and the relationships that he has with them, you get a sense of those personal stakes. Like, really, realistically, he's the only one in full danger. Obviously, some of the filmmakers are in danger at certain times given some of the filming techniques, but they're being very safe about it. And Alex is also being as safe as he can. He's very experienced. He knows what he's doing. But he's really the only person that is at major risk. So you also have to have this sense of personal and emotional stakes, and you get that throughout the entirety of the film. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that this probably has one of the best climaxes of any documentary, because you actually get to see the entire event unfold, or at least the majority of it. Or not, I mean, you get to see the event unfold. You don't get to see it in real time. It's like a 4-hour thing, but you do get to actually kind of witness it and experience it. And for anyone that is worried, Alex is still alive. He survives. That's not a spoiler. He accepted the Oscar with the filmmakers. And that really doesn't change how you feel throughout the movie. You really still have this sense of urgency and just ultimate like dread for a lot of it. It's really kind of just an experience of watching unlike any other that I've ever had. So I kind of talked about this in the story, but I think that it really builds the relationships well, both in scenes where people are together, but also in sort of testimonial type scenes where they're apart, or when it's the filmmakers talking about the film, which is something that's a lot different than a lot of other documentaries that I've seen, is that the filmmakers are really pivotal characters in the story and influence the plot and influence our understanding of the characters, which obviously that's going to happen in any documentary, but actually seeing the filmmakers talk about the documentary is kind of a meta experience that really adds to the drama of the entire piece. So we also get an understanding of who the filmmakers are as characters that kind of influences our understanding of the story, and then we obviously get a really solid understanding of Alex, both from himself, from his relationships, from medical professionals. There's a scene in this movie where one of his doctors basically says that there's a part of your brain that processes fear, and he doesn't have that, which is very telling for the rest of the movie. And so I think in any scene, whether it be scenes of personal relationships together or even people talking about it apart, you really get a sense of characters and how the relationships impact Alex and how Alex impacts everybody else, which I think is really important to understanding the scope of this entire thing. So for documentaries like this that are kind of filmed in real time, production design and cinematography kind of go hand in hand. So I think the big thing here is that you really get a wonderful sense of size and the scope of everything. So like El Capitan is this beauty, like it is just this beautiful mountain rock face. And you get a sense of the size of it given the scenes of people climbing and just the camera angles. There's some beautiful drone shots in this. And then you also get just the landscapes around Yosemite. You really feel, it really just adds, I think, to the beauty of the film. It's some really great B-roll footage, but it also kind of has this juxtaposition of human nature, in a sense, wanting to conquer nature in some way, but then also be connected to it. And so there's this sort of idea that Alex he'll never be satisfied unless he climbs this mountain. So in a sense, conquers it, but he can't do that unless he has an understanding and sort of is in tune with the nature around him. So it's sort of this push and pull that you get from both the cinematography both the cinematography of these big landscape exterior scenes and then also from the more intimate human scenes. The cinematography too is insanely impressive. Because of the fact that he is climbing with no ropes, there's no equipment for him, it's really difficult for the filmmakers to get solid angles without distracting him, without getting in his way, because they want to follow. He has a specific path that he has to follow. He's not going to make it up the mountain if he doesn't do that path. And so the filmmakers have to know where that path is and have to be close to it. But they obviously don't want to distract him in any way or harm him or get him out of that headspace. There's definitely some points that add to the tension of the film where they don't know whether to film it, whether he wants them to film it. So getting some of the angles that they do end up getting when he's climbing alone is gorgeous. They are fantastic shots, some of the best shots I've ever seen in any documentary. They're expansive. They are terrifying. They show how small he is in perspective to everything else. And they're also just like very varied. We get some overhead shots, we get some side angles, we get really every angle of things. We get ones that are pretty close to him, which is very impressive. And then also some ones that just show the sheer size of this mountain that he's climbing when he's on it. The editing, there's some really interesting digital add-ons to the film that show sort of the mountain, that show the mountain range, show the path that he's trying to take. And so that's really nice. Definitely compared to the two other documentaries that I've talked about, that's not something that they utilize. It's a much more recent addition into documentary filmmaking, particularly for films that are being filmed in real time. So I thought that was a really excellent addition. The timing of the film and the pacing also adds to the tension. So the whole time, obviously, we want to see him do it. We want to see him climb free solo, but he doesn't do that for a lot of the film. He is practicing. He's learning kind of the ins and outs of things. There are definitely some injuries that he goes through, some tension, some drama throughout the film. And so the pacing of it is really nice for us to understand how high the stakes are, how difficult this is, and then the climax is that much more cathartic when we've been sitting with these characters for so long. So not only does it have the excitement of a documentary that you want to see for this type of subject matter, but we also get those intimate character moments that give us the quiet space to understand who they are and get that sense of stakes that we wouldn't if we just sort of went into this thing only talking about free soloing and that's it. As far as the sound goes, there are wonderful moments of just like quiet, and you can hear only his breath, or you can only hear sort of the environment around him or the wind. So just the idea of like open space and nature is a really big part of this film that I think adds to the overall tone of things. The score too has that sort of sense of space and the expansiveness of it all, but then also adds some of that tension and some of the intensity of the story. So I think that complements things really well. As far as the directing goes, the directing is, I think, probably one of my favorite aspects of this film. If anything, I would want them to delve more into what the idea of filmmaking is, but clearly this is a story about Alex. It's not a story about filmmaking. The story about filmmaking is kind of secondhand to it. I think it would have been almost more interesting if it was sort of 50-50, or I don't know, because in this it's probably like 70-30, so even 60-40 maybe, but just having the filmmakers be so smart with their filmmaking, both on the subject matter and then also with the way they're presenting it, and they have a really solid understanding of what the risks here are. It's also just like the word that I can describe for them is careful. Like they're careful about what they want to do in regards to what Alex is doing. They're also careful in how they tell this story in a respectful manner, given some of the people that are involved in it. So I just think that they are some fantastic filmmakers, some really great documentary filmmakers, and I would look out for some of the other stuff that they're going to be doing in the future. So I think this documentary is fantastic. I'm going to give this one a solid 9 out of 10. If anything, I would have wanted some more information about what the filmmaking parts of it are, but that's me. I'm a film student, so I would highly recommend you go check this out. It's on Disney Plus and Hulu, so you only need one of those to watch this film. And I hope that you enjoyed the review. Those are the reviews of the movies for this week. But stay tuned for the last segment where I talk about some of the biggest movie news from the past month, a segment that I always enjoy doing at the beginning of every month. But right now, we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Spaceship Earth, the Central Park 5, and Free Solo on this documentary day. And now, given that it is the beginning of the month, I'm going to talk about some of the biggest movie news from August, which is a segment that I am always excited to talk about. A lot of this stuff I don't know before I do the research on it, so I am always really thrilled to do some of the research on it, and I am very happy to report it to you guys. The first thing, sadly, that I do have to report is obviously the passing of Chadwick Boseman, beloved actor. He passed on August 28th after a 4-year battle with colon cancer at the age of 43, but he was diagnosed in 2016 with the public not knowing, and that means he filmed 8 films while he had been diagnosed with stage 3 and then progressing to stage 4. And some of those included Marshall, Black Panther, Avengers Infinity War, and Endgame, some of the biggest movies of all time. So my heart goes out to his family, his friends, and anybody impacted by his death. He was an extremely talented actor, one of my favorites, and I am deeply saddened by this news. But moving on into some lighter news, movie theaters have relatively opened. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, many AMC theaters and other theaters alongside opened on August 20th. Not all, so around me they hadn't opened yet, but that means some of the movies that had been postponed have now opened, which includes Christopher Nolan's Tenet and The New Mutants. Tenet was met with some pretty solid reviews. Not like his highest of all time, but also not his lowest. Well, The New Mutants was not met with some of the best reviews. But I'm definitely curious to go check those out. I'm going to see if I can see them, as soon as I can sometime within this month. My favorite movie news from this past month is called DC Fandom. So DC hosted a digital event in light of not having a Comic-Con, not having any major news coming out of quarantine. DC wanted to host a fan event for anybody subscribed to DC Universe and then subsequently release everything else to the public later that night. And so DC Fandom talked about some of their upcoming properties, both film and video game wise. They neglected to talk about really any of their television properties, but I believe that is coming in the next month, some news on that. And we don't talk about video games here, but we do talk about movies. So some of the things that were detailed at that event was the new Batman movie. It is coming out in 2021, starring Robert Pattinson as the new Batman. It has the Riddler in it, the Penguin in it. The Riddler is being played by Paul Dano. The Penguin is being played by Colin Farrell. Zoe Kravitz is playing Catwoman, and this looks like, similar to The Dark Knight, a gritty spin on Batman, a much more realistic, grounded spin. You can tell kind of by the costuming of Catwoman, Riddler, and the Penguin. I'm definitely very curious to see what this style of Batman has in store. It's very stylistic, very dark. It has some really wonderful visionaries behind it, some fantastic actors. I have to say, I'm probably on the more skeptical route. I don't know necessarily what this film is going to offer besides The Dark Knight. So we've already had sort of this dark and gritty interpretation of Batman, also a relatively young interpretation of Batman. So I'm definitely curious to see what this film has to offer for the general comic book fan, but then also for the movie fan. But the trailer was definitely a very solid trailer to see some of the footage coming out of it. Another trailer that we got was Wonder Woman 84, a film that was slated to release in June, but is now going to be released in October 2nd. In this trailer, we got to see the costuming of Kristen Wiig's Cheetah. So a little bit of more information there. We also get a little bit more information about the plot. This is one movie that I am very excited to see. I really loved Wonder Woman. I had a few things that I didn't love about it, but those seem to be the general consensus of what the people didn't really like about it, so I think those are going to be and can be improved upon in the sequel. The sequel looks more interesting. It looks more vibrant. I'm also very excited when a superhero doesn't have to tell their origin story anymore, so we've gotten past that. We can now just get into the character and the events that transpire in this one, so I'm really, really excited for that. We also got a concept trailer for Black Adam, which is going to be a side piece to Shazam, seeing that he is sort of the main antagonist for Shazam in the comics. Black Adam is played by Dwayne Johnson. This is a project that has been in development for a very long time. Dwayne Johnson has been attached, I think, since like 2016. So getting to see some of the concept art for it in the form of a trailer was really interesting. I think the thing that I found the most interesting throughout the entire DC fandom was the Suicide Squad. So Suicide Squad is a movie from 2016 that did not get very good reviews. It is not a very good movie, although it had a lot of hype around it. And DC has decided to go the route of completely rebooting it after only 4 or 5 years. And I'm super excited about this choice because the Suicide Squad is sort of this kind of campy but still dark and edgy story being told, and so rebooting that one makes a lot of sense. DC also, since Suicide Squad has come out, has given a lot more creative liberty to their directors and their creators. They're going kind of a different route than Marvel has been doing. Marvel obviously has this completely cohesive cinematic universe, whereas DC wants to go a little bit different now, realizing that it didn't fully work for them, so they want to put out movies that are tonally different and sometimes not even all the way connected. And so the Suicide Squad, I'm not fully sure if this is going to be a semi-sequel or a hard reboot. Harley Quinn is still being played by Margot Robbie, and then a few other characters are lapping over, Jai Courtney as Captain Boomerang, and then Joel Kinnaman as Rick Flag, I think. Yeah, Rick Flag. So given that this is a property that oftentimes breaks the fourth wall, I wouldn't be surprised if we get some references to the previous movie, and this is probably going to be somewhat of a sequel/reboot. It's also now being directed by James Gunn, which is probably the most exciting choice for me. James Gunn had previously directed the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and is still signed on for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, but he has a really fantastic sense of character and character building, and there's so many characters in this film. Getting to focus on a few that he's probably going to do while still giving a little bit of a storyline for everybody else is what I'm expecting, and I'm going to be very excited when this one comes out. All of the new additions to the cast seem great. There's some really great casting here, and there's also some really fun comic book characters that I had never even heard of. So the Suicide Squad didn't get a full trailer, but we did get a character introduction trailer, and then we also got some behind-the-scenes footage, which gave some insight into what the movie is going to be about and the overall tone. So I was super excited to see that. We also got a little bit of a trailer for Zack Snyder's Justice League. The Snyder Cut Justice League came out a couple years ago, but was ultimately re-edited and reshot in part by Joss Whedon. So a lot of fans have been clamoring for the Snyder Cut for a long time. Zack Snyder had then a couple months ago announced that it was going to be released on HBO Max in 2021. We still don't know if it's going to be a movie or a miniseries. If it is a movie, it's probably going to be longer than 3 hours. So I'm hoping that it's going to be a miniseries. The other thing that's interesting about this is that there's going to be no footage used from Joss Whedon's version, and a lot of the plot seems very different. So there are some shots in this trailer that are from the version that we've already seen, but there's also a lot of shots that we haven't seen. There's some characters that might be in this that were not in the Whedon version. So although I'm not a huge Snyder fan, I am definitely curious to see what this version is going to change. Alright, so that's DC Fandom. The other major movie that hit theaters over the past week was Bill and Ted Face the Music, a threequel to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And so this one was met with some pretty positive reviews, so hopefully that one is good. Another movie that I want to check out. It was also announced that New Mutants is not a part of the MCU, and also it was never intended to be. This is something that had been kind of known for a long time. I sort of had a little bit of a theory that it was going to end up being tied to New Mutants, or to be tied to the MCU. Maybe it was, and now that it doesn't have great reviews, it's now not. So who knows what the inner workings of that are, but the big thing is that it is not attached to the MCU and solely exists in the X-Men Fox universe. Some major development news is that there's going to be a Haunted Mansion reboot with the writer of Ghostbusters 2016. Although I wasn't a huge fan of the Ghostbusters 2016 movie, I think a lot of that had to do with some of the improvisation that was involved. The script and the story were pretty solid. I'm also a really big fan of the Eddie Murphy Haunted Mansion version from the early 2000s. I think it's a super fun family movie. Also, I think that there are some really good Disney movies based on some of their rides. Although it might be a little bit of a cash grab, I'm kind of excited about this one. I also wouldn't be surprised if Disney is trying to build some sort of mild, lukewarm cinematic universe with the Jungle Cruise coming out and Pirates of the Caribbean getting somewhat rebooted with a new cast of characters. So I'm curious to see what that is going to be like. Alright, another development is that there's going to be a Dear Evan Hansen movie, something that I did not know. Tony Award winning musical on Broadway. It's still running. The part was originated by Ben Platt, so he is still slated to play Evan Hansen, although he feels he might be a bit older, I think it is still going to be very exciting to see him take on the role in the film. Amy Adams has just been cast. That's sort of the reason it's big news. Amy Adams has been cast as his mother. There's also a slew of young actors being cast this movie that I'm super excited about. Caitlin Dever is slated for this from Booksmart. Amandla Stenberg from The Hunger Games and The Hate You Give, Nick Dodani from Atypical, a show that I'm a big fan of. So I'm really excited about this cast. I'm also really excited about this movie. It's one of my favorite musicals of all time. So definitely be on the lookout for some extra news coming out of that film. Some other news, Mulan is going to be released free on Disney Plus in December, so it is going to be open to subscribers in the next couple weeks for $30, something that I'm not a huge fan of. It's also going to be released in theaters in select cities, mostly in select countries, so it's going to have a big release in China. But if you don't want to pay that $30, which I would not recommend, it is going to be released for free on Disney Plus in December by the end of the year. There's also going to be a Grease prequel coming out soon. I apologize if that seemed like it was coming to Disney Plus. I don't know where it's coming. But apparently, Grease is getting a modern update. It might still be set in the 50s. I'm not 100% sure. There's not much known about this project. Other than that, it is being directed by the director of Heart Beats Loud, kind of an indie darling Sundance film that I was also slated to see at the Annapolis Film Festival that did not get to see. And then the final bit of movie news I have for this past month is that Scream 5 is finally getting a release date in 2022. I'm a big fan of the Scream franchise. I haven't seen all of the installments. I'm a huge, huge fan. One of my favorites is the first film. I also really like the second one. I think it's pretty underrated. But this one is getting released in 2022. It also is known that Courtney Cox is back for this installment, so I am very excited about this one, even if it's not up to par with the original, which ultimately it probably won't be. So that's the movie news for August. Not quite as much as last month, but I think part of that has to do with some of the movie theaters reopening and things getting moved around a little bit. But overall, an exciting month for movies as always. Also an exciting episode. I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. I really love making these for you guys. So if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, hit us up at GSMC_movies. We're always checking that out on Twitter. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you could please remember to subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and leave a nice review if you would like, because that really helps us. Also, if you can remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.